Of he who saw the deep, of he who found out all things, I shall tell the land. Of he who experienced everything, I shall teach the whole. He searched lands everywhere. He who experienced the whole gained complete wisdom. He found out what was secret and uncovered what was hidden. He brought back a tale of the flood, times before the flood. He had journeyed far and wide, weary at last resigned. He engraved all toils on a memorial monument of stone. Those are the opening lines of the standard Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The opening lines of the old Babylonian version go like this: surpassing all other kings, or he was superior to all other kings, a warrior lord of great stature, a hero born of Uruk, a goring wild bull. He marches at the front as a leader. He goes behind support of his brothers. Both of these you read within the standard Babylonian version. Remember that the name of the text in ancient Mesopotamia would not have been Gilgamesh. It would have been the first line of the narrative. And the first line of the old Babylonian version is something like surpassing all other kings. And you have that in the standard Babylonian version on page 51 of Stephanie Dalley's edition in Myths from Mesopotamia. You have the phrase, he was superior to other kings, a warrior lord of great stature. That is the opening line from the Old Babylonian version, which we know because one of the texts of the Old Babylonian version refers to it by that line, or by the line that's a translation of. But the standard Babylonian version refers to itself as he who saw the deep, or he who found out all things, which is the first line you have on page 50. And both versions emphasize, as part of his identity, was where he was from and where he was king. The Old Babylonian version says a hero born of Uruk. The standard Babylonian version is more specific. He had the wall of Uruk built, the sheepfold, the holiest Eanna, which is Eanna is the name of the temple of Ishtar in Uruk. The pure treasury. See its wall, which is like a copper band. Survey its battlements, which nobody else can match. Take the threshold, which is from time immemorial. Approach Eanna, the home of Ishtar, which no future king nor any man will ever match. Go up to the wall of Uruk and walk around. Inspect the foundation platform and scrutinize the brickwork. Testify that the bricks are baked bricks. The epic begins and ends with these lines, these descriptions of the walls of Uruk. And the walls of Uruk are something we can actually look. We can actually go around and visit. Because buried under the sands of modern-day Iraq is the city that gave Iraq its name, Uruk. And they don't look quite as impressive now as they probably did at some point, but this at one time was the largest city in the world. In fact, archaeologists describe it as the first city, at least the first large metropolitan area. And it dates back to 3,500 years BC. Though it's now buried underneath the Iraqi desert, Uruk was once on the riverbanks of the Euphrates River. But as you can tell by looking at a larger map, those rivers have changed course a lot over the years. Frequently they change course in association with a large flood. But those walls, before they were buried, were over 20 feet high, and they were protected by battlements, guard towers. And the walls went nearly 6 miles around the city. And not only did they protect the temples and the dwelling places of the people that lived there, they also protected date palm gardens and clay pits. And remember how important the mud bricks are to not only building these walls, but also to making cuneiform tablets, to building works of art that we'll see throughout this presentation. The walls of Uruk were not the first walls built around a city, but they were by far the largest walls that completely encapsulated such a large area. And the date of these walls coincides with the time period of a historical king whose name was Gilgamesh, who is mentioned in the ancient cuneiform documents called the Sumerian king lists. And at that time, Uruk looked something like this. This is a reconstruction of the city with the temple of Eanna, the temple of Ishtar, in the foreground. And as you can see by looking at the horizon, this is a very flat country. There's nothing, no disruption of a flat horizon for as far as the eye can see. So building something as vertical as the Temple of Eanna or the other ziggurats, these raised temples, creates a very profound effect to people that are used to being in a very flat world. And you would go up these stairs not only to be closer to the gods, but to get up above your ordinary world. A principle we'll come back to as we read through the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, Uruk was not founded by Gilgamesh, but as I said, there was a historical king that's accredited with building these walls. In the year, or around the year 1900 BC, there was a king of Uruk named Anam who had inscribed that he restored the walls of Uruk, and he restored not only the walls of Uruk, but he says that they're the walls that were built by Gilgamesh, or that were emboldened or strengthened by Gilgamesh. And the reason this king Gilgamesh seems to have built up these walls was because Uruk, his city, was a smaller, weaker city ruled over by a city called Kish, which was further up the river, about 100 miles near the later city of Babylon. This is before the rise of Babylon. And Gilgamesh seems to have led the forces of Uruk in a battle against Kish, overthrew a king named Akka. And Akka is described in a narrative with one of the earliest narratives, the Sumerian narratives, where Gilgamesh is described as defeating Akka. So all of this seems to come from a very solid kernel of a historical person. So if we take a look at our timeline here, we have Sumerian dynasties ruling over Mesopotamia as early as 3200 BC. But the rise of city-states is a gradual thing. And like I said, Uruk is the first of these large metropolitan areas. That's happening between 3200 BCE and 2500 BCE. During that time, the historical king Gilgamesh would have lived somewhere around between 2700 and 2500 BCE. Sometime in what's called the second early dynastic period. Gilgamesh would have been a Sumerian king, which coming from the southern area of Mesopotamia. After his time period, the Akkadian king from the city of Akkad, further up the rivers, named Sargon, conquers and unites all of Mesopotamia, all these separate city-states. But even after that, even though the rulership changes, the language changes, Sumerian is no longer spoken, Akkadian replaces it, and Akkadian is a Semitic language like Hebrew or Arabic. But even after that, there's so much respect for the culture of that time period and respect for Gilgamesh himself that his story continues to be recounted, usually in the original language, at least for a few centuries, before the Akkadian versions, which you read a translation of. The Babylonian versions, both the Old Babylonian version and the Standard Babylonian version, are in Akkadian. But they're translations of fragments of other stories. These other earlier stories we can attribute to a king named Shulgi, living around the year 2150. And he commissions several narratives to be inscribed on tablets in Sumerian about Gilgamesh. And they're not unified in one epic. We don't yet have the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have individual narratives about Gilgamesh that Shulgi commissions. Then, sometime between 2000 BC and 1600 BC, across a large time period, we have the creation of the Old Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, roughly contemporary with the Old Babylonian version of Atrahasis. And after that, we have what's we describe as the middle versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And those are very interesting because even though we don't have enough of them, as much of them as we'd like, we have bits and pieces of them spread all over a huge geographic area. If you look at the letters MV on the map in the bottom right, you see that these middle versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh were found as far north as Nineveh, and actually even further north. But they were found on the coast of the Mediterranean, in modern-day Israel, Lebanon, in the city of Megiddo, the city of Ugarit, which were major, not as large as Uruk, but they were large and important cities on the trade route between Mesopotamia and Egypt. And we also have the middle versions found as far north as the city of Hattusa. This is where the Hittites are from. The Hittites had a third empire. There was the sort of Babylonian Mesopotamian area of empires over a couple thousand years. We all know about ancient Egypt being a very formidable civilization. But people frequently have forgotten about the Hittites, which is another literate and powerful military empire in modern-day Turkey, which was previously called Anatolia. And Hattusa had copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, of the middle version. Ugarit had copies of the middle version. Megiddo in modern-day Israel had copies. So this was a very popular story that was spread very far and wide. And finally, a millennium after the Old Babylonian version, the latest Old Babylonian versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and a millennium and a half after Shulgi commissions the first written Gilgamesh texts, we have the standard Babylonian version. Sometime between 668 and 625, during the reign of Ashurbanipal, a king who was very proactive in trying to preserve a lot of the literary traditions and build up these large libraries in his capital city of Nineveh on the Tigris River. Over a millennium, this epic has been built up and finally becomes the standard Babylonian version, which is most of what you read. Now, I asked you to read both, read a section of the standard Babylonian version, and then stop and go back and read what fragments we have of the old Babylonian version in order to try to put the two stories together. And you probably found a lot of words that are shared between the two. So there's a historical kernel of truth, or at least a kernel of fact. There was a historical king named Gilgamesh. There was a victory over this city-state of Kish. And this the decline of Kish seems to match the rise of Uruk in the archaeological record. But as with anything, legends as well as myths, historical kernel of truth not only sort of spawns different versions, it also tends to merge with other stories in the oral tradition. And the stories that were told about him, the songs that were sung about him, likely preserve the memory of his victory over Kish, his exploits on the battlefield, his building of the walls of Uruk. But they also carried on a tradition that doesn't show up quite as obvious in the Epic of Gilgamesh as you read it. But Gilgamesh was thought to be a judge in the underworld. There was this whole tradition connected with the lower Mesopotamian religion that saw Gilgamesh as the sort of the Saint Peter. When you died and you went to the underworld, it would be Gilgamesh who sat in judgment over you and decided what happened to you. So we follow that through history from 2600 thereabouts BC to the standard Babylonian version during the reign of Ashurbanipal. A lot of things have happened. A lot of fragmentary stories have diverged from the original historical fact or the original historical person. And they've sort of diverged and then they've recombined into stories that may or may not be entirely recognizable to the people that lived a few centuries before them. I'll come back to this idea at the end of the talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh, when you'll have seen some examples of fragments and elements within the narrative that don't seem to quite fit. They won't. It'll be quite obvious that this wasn't a single author publication like a modern novel, but there are elements that are coming from somewhere else, and it's not always obvious where that somewhere else is. But like I said, I'll come back to that. And as you can imagine, even during a king's lifetime, his court poets, his courtiers are going to beef up his reputation. They're going to exaggerate his exploits. Even if he actually did have impressive exploits, they're going to describe it as if it was almost godlike. And that's while the king's alive. After the king's dead, being remembered a generation, 2, 3, 4 generations later, the exploits get larger and larger. Most of the specific, incidents might be relatively well preserved, but the king's prowess, strength, intelligence, and this sort of thing get exaggerated. And it's similar to what happens in mythology of the gods. And remember, Gilgamesh is 2/3 god. I'm not sure how you become 2/3 anything, but they imagined him, they say in the epic that he's two-thirds god, one-third mortal. And his exploits take on this godlike size and impressiveness. And there are works of art dating back possibly even before the reign of the historical king that are frequently referred to as Gilgamesh figures. So on the top right here, this is an impression from a cylinder seal, and the cylinder, the actual artifact is this round cylinder on in the middle, and you use it to roll over wet clay, and it creates the image. And there's this figure you see fighting lions. Frequently, you'll see other cylinder seals like this. He's fighting bulls. He's fighting antelopes. He's fighting these monster-like creatures. But you see those 6 curls, 3 on either side of his head. That seems to indicate, or that common image is associated with all of these. And this figure has been referred to as the Gilgamesh figure. Now, maybe it's Gilgamesh, maybe it's not. We'll see some cylinder seals that identify the hero as Gilgamesh, but most of them are just like this. They refer to whoever the stamp belongs to, the seal belongs to, but they include these images that you're just supposed to recognize. But from the lifetime of the historical king Gilgamesh all the way down to the time of Ashurbanipal, when the standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh was written, we have the statue on the top left that's currently in the Louvre Museum in Paris, of this gigantic human figure that's holding a lion, just to sort of show you the size. If you imagine the actual size of a lion and how big this human being would be, I believe the statue itself, you can stand under it and it's at least 10 feet tall. It's about twice my size. So obviously, even if there was a historical Gilgamesh, there wasn't necessarily a historical Humbaba or historical bull of heaven that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had to fight. And in that regard, he's somewhat like a god, but he's also, in the description, but also in the evolution of his story, something like a modern comic book character. So let's take the example of the current Marvel Cinematic Universe incarnation of the god Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth. Thor, the name, the fact that he carries a hammer and all this, supposedly derives from Norse mythology, and a kernel of it does. They're going back at least 1,000 years. We have records of stories about a god of thunder who carries this thunder hammer called Mjolnir. Well, that representation changes over the 1,000 years for which we have art representing him. It starts off, or at least the earliest we have, is something like the figure on the left, and that looks very different than this conception that the painters and artists of the 19th century had in their heads when they represented him as sort of like one of themselves, a larger, fiercer, stronger version of a 19th century man, except dressed in animal skins and that sort of thing. Well, there's an element of that. There's the current MCU version of Thor kind of follows in that tradition. He also follows in the Superman tradition. He's a comic book figure, and Marvel was notorious for sort of ripping off DC figures. And he's got the red cape like Superman. He flies through the air like Superman. The original Thor did not fly through the air. It's kind of oddly described that his chariot can go through the sky, but his hammer didn't fly and he didn't fly. These are things that the schemas come from the DC comics Superman that's been around since 1939. So Superman didn't have anything to do with the Norse god Thor, but we can see with the Marvel version of Thor this confluence, this coming together of two schemas and potentially two scripts. The schemas of the cape and the flying is a Superman schema. The schema of the hammer and the reference to the Norse gods is the Norse schema. This is the same thing that is happening with Gilgamesh. There's the historical king, there's stories about this judge in the underworld. There are these figures of these heroes that roam around the countryside fighting lions and bulls and that sort of thing. And these things all seem to merge. And once they become a written text, that becomes a redaction. And we also have a historical place to start this. There was a king named Shulgi who lived between 2094 BC and 2047 BC. Shulgi was the king of Ur, just down the river. from Uruk. But he was very much enamored of this, ancient, possibly ancestor. He claimed to be descended from Gilgamesh, and he described Gilgamesh as like a brother to him. And he wanted to model his kingship on Gilgamesh as he understood him from these stories. And in order to make that connection, one of the things he did was become basically the first patron of literature. He sponsored scribes. He had scribes write down these oral stories. But of course, not all the oral stories match. There was a lot of contradictions between one story and another. And you have to make a decision when there's that sort of contradiction. You have to decide, do I try to fit them together and just sort of leave out the part that I think is doesn't fit, or do I need to include everything? And this is what you had to deal with when you read Atrahasis, because Stephanie Dalley gives us everything from these fragments. She doesn't leave out the part about the Sarupu disease in the second fragment. You have to figure out that, oh, well, there's this version and there's this version. There's one version in which Anu takes the side of the Igigi and says, yes, their plight was too hard. Then there's another version in which Enki or Ea takes the side of the Igigi and says the exact same words. Do you leave out one or the other, or do you include both of them? Shulgi seems to have decided it's better to include everything. He says when he commissions these different Gilgamesh narratives to be written down, not the Epic of Gilgamesh, remember, that comes later, but these individual Gilgamesh narratives, he commissions them to be written down on cuneiform, or in cuneiform on clay tablets. And he says, quote, I am no fool as regards the knowledge acquired since the time that heaven above set mankind on its path. When I have discovered hymns from past days, old ones from ancient times, I have never declared them to be false, and I have never contradicted their contents. I have conserved these antiquities, never abandoning them to oblivion. So as we learn from the War of the Ghosts example, stories can change when they're recalled, but you also see this desire to have the story retold in the same narrative, the same way, because you don't know where it came from. It came from this divine wisdom, and you don't want to change that. So redaction becomes a difficult process, but a process in which you include the contradictions instead of trying to decide yourself, what do I leave out? And because we have all these contradicting versions, we end up in the situation that Stephanie Dalley describes in your introduction to her edition of Gilgamesh. She says, our interest lies not only in the story and its characters, but also in the unique opportunity the epic provides for tracing earlier independent folktales, which were combined in the creation of the whole work. And we can see how the whole work in written form never became fossilized, but was constantly altered through contact with a continuing oral narrative tradition. And we might think, I can go back and find an text and find the story. But no, she says, a new fragment may perplex us rather than elucidating an old problem. In fact, the more text fragments come to light, the harder it becomes to produce the one coherent edition. So as much as we might like to find that text, that single original that preserves the real story, the real Gilgamesh, what we find is just the opposite. If we go further back and we have this gap in the puzzle, we're looking for those puzzle pieces, we're looking for those fragments of cuneiform text that would tell us what happened between this part and this part, and we find more fragments, instead of finding the piece that fits real snugly into that gap in the puzzle, instead we find more pieces and we don't know where to put them. They contradict the pieces we already have. They seem to be doublets. Remember that term. A doublet is retelling the same story but in a different narrative, sometimes with contradictions. So we're never going to find that text. We're never going to find that original version. Instead, what we have is a story that is multiform. And I'm going to use that term the way folklore researchers use it, which is to describe not just not as an adjective that describes the story, but the story is a multiform. I'm going to use it as a noun, which means there's not the one version, but there's all the versions together as if they were this sort of toolbox or this puzzle set that has pieces from lots of different puzzles. But any individual narrator, any individual poet, any individual scribe who writes it down on cuneiform, who creates one iteration, one version of that in narrative form, that scribe or that singer has this multiform box full of pieces to choose from. And he or she is only going to choose some of those pieces. But we as scholars, when we read this, have to go back and think, what else is being left out? Is it being left out intentionally? Is it something that has been forgotten at this point in history? Or is it something that just doesn't fit with this particular iteration's themes and what this particular scribe or redactor finds most important? Because despite Shulgi's best efforts and best intentions, you can't tell a story without leaving things out. You can't tell a story without making, you can't create one iteration in narrative form without making some executive decisions. And if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have the sort of unified or mostly unified whole that we have in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So notice we shift in the old Babylonian version to call it the Epic of Gilgamesh rather than just these independent Gilgamesh narratives. And to understand what we mean by that, we have to define the word epic. And you may have had a definition or two. You may have learned some of these characteristics in high school English class. But an epic, for our purposes, is going to connect to a form as it was described by the ancient Greeks, a century after, at least a century after, the latest version, the standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh, and thousands of years after the oldest versions. So we're, to some extent, imposing a historically, non-historical context, a schema of what a story should be, or a script about that should shape this data that doesn't belong. And the Greeks who came up with this definition will be the first to tell us that. But we have to at least be aware that we're doing it. So epic, as we're going to define it, and we're going to read 3 more epics in here, depending on how you define them, maybe more than 3. But it's going to have some of these characteristics. The standard definition of epic is it's a long narrative poem. In other words, it tells a story as a narrative, but it's also a poem. It also pays close attention to the scansion, the order of the words, and the rhythm. It's like a song. It doesn't just tell a story, but it tells a story in poetic form. And it's written in an elevated style, which means it's not the way people talk every day. It's something that sounds very artistic. If you heard somebody speaking, in a particular, if you heard somebody speaking in King James English or Shakespearean English, you would know that that person's not just having a conversation. That person is actually reciting literature. So an epic would be written in an elevated style. It would be presenting characters of high social rank and national importance. This is very important because we're going to come across a narrative much later on that defies this tradition. But for the most part, it's going to have a character from the nobility, an aristocrat, maybe a king, maybe somebody who's a part of the royal family. We almost never have mentioned people who were not royalty or nobility. And they're going to be in adventures forming an organic whole through their relationship to a central heroic figure, and through their developments of episodes important to the history of a nation or a people. So it's not just an independent story that people wouldn't have cared about at the time. It's something that the actions of this one person are going to cause an entire people, a nation, not in the sense of a nation state, but a nation is in a group of people with a common culture and common language and common identity, are going to rise or fall based on the actions of this one hero. Now, secondary characteristics, typically the hero is of imposing physical ability and stature. So like Gilgamesh, if he's large enough to pick up a lion like it's a cat, then this is someone who's clearly imposing physically. It's also a hero of national importance or international importance. As we saw, Gilgamesh is remembered in Uruk for more than 1,000 years, but he's also remembered in these other city-states, which are different, have different national identities. And he's of historical or legendary significance as the founder of a nation. So Uruk wasn't founded by Gilgamesh, but Gilgamesh built the wall and he was their most famous king. Another characteristic is there tends to be a journey over a wide geographic setting, sometimes to another world, to a supernatural realm, to the underworld, to heaven, or something like that. There's an action consisting of great deeds and overcoming great conflict. As I mentioned earlier, every narrative is going to have some sort of conflict, but the level, the physical conflict, the fact that Gilgamesh isn't just up against large monsters, he's up against the gods. That is about as big a conflict as you're going to get. And because there are gods and monsters, there are supernatural forces that are involved in that action. That's another secondary characteristic. Now, not everything we call an epic is going to have all these characteristics, and Gilgamesh may or may not have every single one of them, but these are enough. There is a sort of, you get enough checks on the checklist, and people tend to describe it as an epic. And we definitely have this, 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years of individual narratives being redacted and placed into a form, into a schema of what a story should look like, according to the people of subsequent generations. And it starts to resemble the expectations of narrative we still have today. It has a beginning, a middle, and end. It has a protagonist overcoming conflict in order to achieve a resolution in the end. But notice, even though it's very familiar, that form of a story, that narrativization, it also plays with our expectations, and it doesn't give us exactly what we expect, especially in the end. But for the beginning, we have something that is still a staple of storytelling, from literature to Hollywood movies. And that is, we start with a character exposition. Character exposition is the first time we see a character described in the narrative. And this character exposition is never random. It's never just doing an activity that is not relevant to the rest of the story. In this case, we have Gilgamesh described as a tyrannical king. He doesn't seem like the protagonist. At least he doesn't seem like a good guy. He doesn't seem like a guy we're going to empathize with. He's described in terms that sound at once like praise, but also are very critical. The narrator tells us on page 52, he had no rival at his puku, and your note tells you that puku is this sort of field sport, this athletic competition. His weapons would rise up, his comrades have to rise up. The young men of Uruk became dejected in their private quarters. And it's a guess as to exactly what this means, but it seems whatever it is, he won't leave them alone. Either he's forcing them into this competition, which causes them injury and to be humiliated, but they have no choice because he's the king. Day and night, his behavior was overbearing. He was the shepherd, and if we fill in the rest of that line with the line that the repetition or the refrain further down page 52, powerful, superb, knowledgeable, and expert. Gilgamesh would not leave the young girls alone. The daughters of warriors, the brides of young men, the gods often heard their complaints. The gods of heaven, the Lord of Uruk. This combination between he is the shepherd of Uruk, the sheepfold. In other words, as king, he's supposed to be the protector. His people, the people of Uruk, are his flock, and he's supposed to be protecting them. Yet, he is their shepherd, yet, is the next line, and even though part of it is broken in both versions of the refrain, it's followed by powerful, superb, and knowledgeable and expert. Gilgamesh would not leave the young girls alone, the daughters of warriors, the brides of young men. So he's supposed to be protecting people, that's his job as a ruler, but instead he's using his physical power as well as his institutional power to force his way on both the young men and the young women. And so the people pray to the gods to do something about him, and that's where the gods come up with the creation of Enkidu. Enkidu introduces for Gilgamesh the conflict that's going to change him as an individual. And it may have seemed like Gilgamesh was more of an antagonist than a protagonist up to this point, but if we look at him over the entire epic, over the entire narrative, we see that he goes through this huge change. And the first change is introduced very quickly. He goes from being this tyrant to being a hero in search of a quest. And the thing that is required to disrupt his equilibrium is Enkidu. And remember that in narrativization, there's a state of equilibrium at the beginning, and something throws that into turmoil, and that has to be overcome. Well, obviously Gilgamesh has been a source of turmoil and of conflict for everyone else, but now the story for him begins because now his conflict begins and forces him to react. So this begins what's going to be his character arc. A character arc is the change a character goes through from the beginning of a narrative to the end. And that change is only going to be brought about if the normal world is thrown into disarray and that character has to do something about it and grow from it. But how exactly does this work? Well, it involves Enkidu. Now, who is Enkidu? Enkidu is another character that has his own character arc within this narrative. But he also has apparently a backstory outside of the narrative. There are these figures that go back, 1,000 years before the standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh, that include this figure that has become referred to as the Enkidu figure, or the Eabani figure, another translation of his name, both of which involve the name of the god Enki or Ea, even though the Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't tell us anything about a connection between Enkidu and Enki, or Eabani and Ea. But there's this figure of this human-like or bull-like human that either has horns or has the lower quarters of a bull, but is doing like the Gilgamesh figure on these cylinders. He's fighting lions. He's sort of hugging in this image on the top right. He's fraternizing with the animals. He's the sort of lord of the animals, or at least the herbivores, the ungulates, the antelope, the bulls, and that sort of thing. He's fighting against lions. He's protecting them from lions. So he's a man of the wilderness, but not a hunter. He's the one that causes trouble for the hunter. In fact, that's what we see him first doing on page 53 when this young hunter has traps to try to kill animals. And Enkidu keeps disarming these traps, and this young hunter can't do anything because it's too fearsome an opponent to directly confront. But it's ambiguous whether or how Enkidu is imagined in the Epic of Gilgamesh itself. This figure of this half bull, half human might be the forerunner of Enkidu. He might not be. There's a lot of gaps in that interpretation, but this is one way to imagine him, especially when he's described as losing his legs when he becomes more civilized. The legs may be the legs you see in the figure in the top left and the figure in the bottom, where he's the upper half human, but he has the back legs of a bull. This image on the top right, he looks like a normal human, although clearly he's sort of fraternizing these human-faced bulls. But that image comes from the Queen's lyre, the Queen's harp that I introduced in a previous lecture. If you'll notice, if you can see, it's not quite big enough, but there are these images on the very front, and there are other images on the back of this harp. So if this harp is being used to tell stories, being used to sing epics, to sing narratives, then it makes sense that the images on the front and back of it that decorate it are from prominent stories that people would be hearing sung to them while the singer played this harp. But this is one of those. There is this image of this figure that seems to be an Enkidu figure. Now these other two images of Enkidu with the features of a bull, the reason that tends to be associated with Enkidu is because it usually is in conjunction with that Gilgamesh figure. So we have some more cylinder seals here, both of which date back to around 2200 BC. And we'll have one entirely human figure, the Gilgamesh figure with the three curls on either side of his head, and we have the bull man, Enkidu, or the Enkidu figure. And they're usually fighting lions, or they're fighting, in the case on the bottom, a water buffalo. Later we'll see them fighting the bull of heaven that shows up in the narrative later. So it seems that if this isn't a Gilgamesh figure and not an Enkidu figure, then at least this story, whatever it seems to represent, merges later with Gilgamesh and Enkidu as these two almost superhuman warrior hunter figures that go out and pass the time by fighting with lions and bulls and that sort of thing. The kind of thing that larger-than-life heroes do. Now, right at the beginning, he's described as a skybolt of skybolt of Ninurta. And your note, note 10 on page 53, if you follow that, the editor, Stephanie Daly, tells you that term could mean like a meteor, this meteor thrown across the sky. But it also has these connotations that make us question the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. The word for the skybolt or the meteor is kisru, and it sounds a lot like kesru, which is the Sumerian or the Akkadian term for a male prostitute. And he's also described as an axe, hasinu. And there seems to be a play on words with the word asinu, which is a eunuch, a male who's been castrated, and took the female role in sexual rituals at Ishtar's temple. So this makes us look at the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu as a potentially sexual relationship, although obviously we've already read that Gilgamesh was a sexual threat, a sexual predator toward the young women of Uruk. And later we're going to read about the sacred prostitute Shamhat and the fact that they made love for 7 days and 6 nights. So even if there is this implication of a sexual relationship between the two, again, it doesn't fit our modern schemas about either homosexuality or heterosexuality. It seems to just be hypersexuality in both of their cases. And the role of sexuality generally in this narrative and in these other contributing narratives also doesn't resemble our modern schema. So why was Shamhat sent out to Enkidu? Why was this Gilgamesh's solution? It seemed that part of his plan all along was this knowledge that having this sexual relationship with Shamhat would civilize him, would turn him from this wild man into this civilized man. And it doesn't all happen immediately, but this begins Enkidu's transition and potentially the conflict. At least he's gonna, curse her later for bringing him into civilization. Gilgamesh seems aware on the bottom of 54 or the top of 55 when he says to the young hunter that if we send Shamhat, he, Enkidu, will see her and get close to her. Then his cattle who have grown up in open country with him will become alien to him. And so she goes and presents herself to Enkidu out in the wilderness. And when he was sated with her charms, he set his face toward open country of his cattle. In other words, he's after a week of lovemaking, he's gotten all he wants, and he thinks he's going to turn around and go home. But when he set his face towards the open country of his cattle, the gazelles saw Enkidu and scattered. The cattle of the open country kept away from his body, for Enkidu had stripped. His body was too clean. His legs, which he used to keep pace with his cattle, were at a standstill. Enkidu had been diminished, so he could not run as before. Yet he had acquired judgment and had become wiser. In other words, he no longer is, covered in fur if he had this bull body before. And he doesn't have the bull legs that could run so quickly anymore. In other words, he has been converted from the sort of bull man into a complete human. And he's become physically weaker, but he's become wiser like a human, less like an animal. He had acquired judgment, become wiser. And so when the animals run away from him, he turns back towards Shamhat, and Shamhat says to him, "You have become profound, Enkidu. You have become like a god." This line will come across again in a recognizable form in another text. But notice this dichotomy. There's this sort of sexual initiation that takes this animal man and turns him into a civilized man, or at least begins that journey. So she tells him, "Come, let me take you into Uruk, the sheepfold, to the pure house, the dwelling of Anu and Ishtar, where Gilgamesh is perfect in strength and is like a wild bull." Ironic in that Enkidu is no more like a wild bull. But Gilgamesh is like a wild bull, more powerful than any of the people. And it says, knowing his own mind now, he would seek for a friend. So we have the first description of his motivation to go with her. He's looking for a friend, an equal. Enkidu spoke to her, to the harlot, "Come, Shamhat, invite me to the pure house, the holy dwelling of Anu and Ishtar, where Gilgamesh is perfect in strength and is like a wild bull, more powerful than the people." The same refrain, which when being sung would be appropriate, although it may get repetitive when we have to read it over and over again. But then he says, "Let me challenge him. In Uruk I shall be the strongest. I shall go in and alter destiny. One who is born in open country has superior strength." We get the urban versus rural clash. Before he goes into the city, he's going in as with conflict on his mind, with this feeling of insecurity, maybe that he needs to prove himself as being superior to the king of the city. And incidentally, Texans, before you go saying, "Yeah, I'm like him, I'm a country boy," remember he was the enemy of the hunters, so you kind of have to choose. But he goes toward the city, and as they're going toward the city, Shamhat is telling him what to expect in the city, how the people look, what they do. And she continues to describe Gilgamesh, and notice she describes him as he does not sleep by day or night. This is something that's going to change when we get to book 11. But she describes Gilgamesh specifically by the fact he doesn't sleep. And the irony follows immediately after that when we're told that at the same time that Shamhat and Enkidu are making their way toward the city, at the same time Shamhat is telling Enkidu that Gilgamesh doesn't sleep, Gilgamesh is asleep, and he has a dream about Enkidu. And in that dream, Gilgamesh says to his mother, the goddess Ninsun, Mother, I saw a dream in the night. There were stars in the sky for me, and something like a skybolt of Anu. And remember the term there, having the double meaning. And over on page 58, I loved it as a wife, doted on it, carried it and laid it at your feet. Ninsun repeats the refrain, sings the next chorus of the song again, but when she does it, she's explaining to him who this person is. This person will be like a wife. This person will be like a skybolt of Anu. You will love him like a wife, and you will dote on him. And he will always keep you safe. This is the meaning of your dream. So at least he knows that someone is on the way that will be this sort of partner for him. And that concludes the first tablet on page 59. Then we get to tablet 2 of the standard Babylonian version, and we have kind of a broken up story. And this is where I asked you to read the rest of that tablet and then stop and go back and read, or actually I asked you to read the first 2 tablets. But tablet 2 has enough of us to sort of figure out that Enkidu arrives in Uruk, something about putting food in front of him, something about slew wolves, something about the shepherd's hut. Then Enkidu blocks the father-in-law's house. There's some sort of wrestling in the streets between Enkidu and Gilgamesh. And then everybody's crying. And you're probably wondering what's just happened. And 29 lines are missing after that. And not only do the tablet that Stephanie Dalley has to translate here, not only is that broken up, but even within that tablet, if you look on page 62 toward the bottom, there's in parentheses the new break, ellipses, ... new break. That was actually written by the scribe to say that his source, or her source, was also broken. So if you follow the note to note 23, you find that even this scribe's, in Ashurbanipal's time, the scribe who's writing this tablet has a tablet in which there's a break, and rather than just skipping over it, the scribe wants to note that there is a break here, so that's why I'm missing something. And then the counselors of Uruk are telling Gilgamesh something about Humbaba, asking him not to go, but then we have the end of the tablet. So we don't have much to tablet 2 in this standard Babylonian version. And that's why your assignment was to read the first 2 tablets, pages 50 to 61, and then go back to the old Babylonian version, in which you read tablet 1 through 3, but your tablet 2 is a little bit more substantive. So whereas when you read Atrahasis, Stephanie Dalley took the old Babylonian version, which was the more complete, and had you read most of it, but then she would switch to SBV in the middle and then come back to the OBV at the end. Now she's separated them out, so you have to be the one to redact it. You have to sort of keep these things in mind as you go back from one to the other and try to fill in the gaps. So what you're doing is comparing the standard Babylonian version, which in this one tablet is less complete. Normally it's much more complete than the old Babylonian version, but in this case, the tablet you see on the left is actually 2 sides of the same tablet that I've just flipped over. But this is the sort of broken tablet 2 from the standard Babylonian version that dates from around 600 BCE. And on the right, you have the older one, the 1,000 years older, actually, maybe 1,400 years older. And that's the what's called the Philadelphia tablet. And as you can see, it's a lot more complete. There's a few breaks, but we can still see that there's a lot more cuneiform text surviving. And so what you have to do is actually take the 2 together, at least the translations of the 2, and try to make them make more sense. So in these 2 columns, on the left you have the standard Babylonian version, which you have in your book on pages 59 to 60. And on the right you have the old Babylonian version from pages 138 to 139. So again, this is Enkidu and Shamhat on their way from the wilderness, the far wilderness, to the largest city in the world, the first sort of major metropolitan area in the world. And in this, they're going between the two, and it's a gradual process, but you wouldn't know what's happening just to look at tablet 2. So tablet 2, we have this. Enkidu was seated before her in Tiranu, something about tears, trusted someone, why, something. They were consulting together by themselves at his decision, who understood his heart, which Shamhat, something about a garment, something about a second garment. But if you take those references to a garment and a second garment, and you flip over to 138, you see, oh, okay, she took off her garments and clothed Enkidu, in a second garment, took his hand like a goddess, led him to the shepherd's hut, which there was a sheep pen. And then while they're at the shepherd's hut, keep in mind, this is halfway between the wilderness and the city. We're in the rural area, the farming, the agricultural, the pastoral area, where there are shepherds, and they're not in clay brick buildings yet, but they're in a hut. So he's halfway between the wilderness and the civilization. And the shepherds gather over him, but then of course we have a gap of 4 or 5 lines in the old Babylonian version. But now we can switch back over. We take that line, the shepherds gathered over him, and we see the same line in the standard Babylonian version, so we use that to fill in the old Babylonian version. Okay, the shepherds gathered over him of their own accord and by themselves, the young men, how like Gilgamesh in build, the shepherds were saying, the young man, how like Gilgamesh in build, mature in build, and sturdy as battlements, as sturdy as a tower, as a fortress. Why was he born in the mountains? He is just as powerful in strength in his arms as the skybolt of Anu. So they're gathering around him. This is what Gilgamesh foresaw in his dream that we just saw from tablet 1. They're gathering around him and admiring how big a guy he is and how formidable he appears to be. And so they put food in front of him. They put drink in front of him. But he's still a little bit wild. He hasn't made that transition yet, so he would not eat the food. He narrowed his eyes and stared. In other words, he looks at it and thinks, this isn't food. Remember, he's been eating grass. He's been drinking directly from the rivers and streams. So this doesn't fit his idea of food. This is baked bread, which we know if we flip back over to the old Babylonian version. So he used to suck the milk of wild animals. They put food in front of him. He narrowed his eyes, looked, and stared. Enkidu knew nothing of eating bread or drinking beer. So beer, civilization. Bread, civilization. You can't find beer or bread out in the wilderness. This takes some coordinated human effort. This takes infrastructure. This takes a community of people with various expertise in various things in order to grow the wheat, harvest the wheat, mill the wheat, bake the flour. So this is sort of step by step towards civilization, and the first thing is what he regards as food, what fits his schema. So Enkidu has to change his schema for what food and what drink is in order to make his way into civilization. So he had never learned. And the harlot made her voice heard and spoke to Enkidu. Eat the food, Enkidu, the symbol of life. So not just something that will sustain you, but the symbol of life. This represents life. Drink the beer, the destiny of the land. Well, that could mean a couple of things in our modern schema, but clearly it's a good thing for them. Enkidu ate the bread until he had had enough. He drank the beer, 7 whole jars. He's off to a good start. Relaxed, felt joyful. His heart rejoiced. His face beamed. He smeared himself with something. His body was hairy. He anointed himself with oil. It became like any man. Put on clothes. He was like a warrior. Took his weapon. So what he's doing now that his sort of fur, his animal fur has dropped off. His animal legs have been replaced by human legs. Now he's starting to groom himself and bathe himself and dress like a civilized human. And this also helps us fill in the gaps about what he was doing. So apparently he spent some time at the shepherd's hut, but we don't really know what if we just look at tablet 2. Tablet 2 has too many gaps. Something about he slew wolves, something about the herdsman, something about Uruk the sheepfold, and then there's a longer gap. But if we look at the old Babylonian version, we know, he was fighting with lions. The shepherds could rest at night. In other words, their flocks were safe because he was killing lions, he was killing wolves. The older herdsmen lay down. Enkidu was their guard. A man awake. So again, this imagery about being alive, being awake, being a formidable individual, depending on how awake you are. And finally, we have a few more clues about what exactly Enkidu's motivation was, and what we had hints of at the very beginning about the practice that Gilgamesh had of harassing the young women of Uruk. On page 139 in the Old Babylonian version, we are introduced to this person who comes to the shepherd's hut on his way to a wedding. Shamhat, or in the Old Babylonian version, Shamkat, and Enkidu question this young man, and he tells them, "They have invited me to the houses of the fathers-in-law. It is the people's destiny for choosing daughters-in-law. I fill the table of ceremonies with delightful food for the father-in-law's city." So we have a wedding planner, someone involved in preparing weddings. But for the king of spacious Uruk, open the something of people for bridegrooms. For Gilgamesh, the king of spacious Uruk, open the something of people for bridegrooms. He will impregnate the destined wife. He first, the husband afterwards. So we have a prima nocte, this ritual where the king, the overlord, gets to sleep with the bride on her wedding night before her husband does. And this seems to not go over well with Enkidu. At the word of the young man, his face went livid. And so that is where the confrontation happens. When he finally gets to Uruk, Enkidu places himself in the door of the father's house. So back on page 60 in the standard Babylonian version, we have now some more idea about what is actually happening here. We're told that Enkidu blocked his access at the door of the father-in-law's house. What did that mean? Well, now we know. This is the father of the bride. So in other words, this house is where the bride lives. Gilgamesh is on his way to force himself on the bride on her wedding night, but now Enkidu has stepped in, literally blocking the door so that he can't do that. And that's where the fight between them begins. And so now we have these two supernaturally strong warriors wrestling with each other throughout the city, and they're sort of knocking the walls down. The walls shook. They demolished the door frame. So they fight for a while, and then we have this realization that Gilgamesh realizes this is the person he had the dream about. This is the skybolt of Anu that he would love like a wife. And that's when he breaks down crying. And tablet 2 of the Old Babylonian version ends, notice on page 141, by naming itself as second tablet of, quote, "he was superior to other kings," end quote. So this is that catch line that lets us know that this is the second tablet of this longer multi-tablet series, which is titled "He Who Surpasses Other Kings," which was the original title of the Old Babylonian version. And that allows us to connect that with that same line in the standard Babylonian version, something like "he was superior to all of the kings," and let us know that the tablet 1 of the standard Babylonian version added more to the beginning than the original Old Babylonian version had. So now the two sort of co-heroes are united. They're no longer in opposition, and more importantly, now Gilgamesh can focus his attention on doing something other than harassing his people. And now that they've sort of realized that they're both these sort of other than each other, nobody can match them, they decide to go off and find a bigger target, a new enemy to fight with, and that is Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. So they begin their journey to the cedar forest, or in Dali's translation, it's the pine forest. And the obvious motive seems to be to face this new challenge. The village, or the city elders, advise them not to go, but Gilgamesh tells them and tells his mother Ninsun that his mind is made up. And Ninsun goes up to the top of her house. Notice that even she, a goddess, to talk to Shamash, goes up on top of her house. She has to get up above the everyday world and make a sacrifice, burning a sacrificial offering to Shamash, the sun god, even though he's a fellow god. So she goes up high, she makes a burnt offering. That's how she gets the attention of Shamash, the sun god. And she asks him to look after her son because he has a restless spirit. And that's a translation. In the original Akkadian, it's literally he has a spirit that cannot sleep. And of course, that's going to be ironic later on when sleep is the one thing he can't avoid doing. But right now, there's a lot of play on his inability to sleep, his restlessness. And that's what's driving him. That's what's motivating him. The description of Humbaba is pretty ferocious. Whose shout is the flood weapon, whose utterance is fire, whose breath is death. Can hear for a distance of 60 leagues through the forest. So who can penetrate this forest? So Gilgamesh and Enkidu have been warned. This is not someone you want to tangle with, and that seems to be the very motivation for them to do it. No one, who else on earth could take the two of us on together? Let's go tackle this unbeatable monster. But there's also more basic economic motivation to this quest, and that is, remember that in Uruk and in Mesopotamia, the primary building material is mud brick. And you can stack up mud bricks and you can build pyramids. You can build these impressive ziggurats that stand up like man-made mountains. You can build these impressive walls. But where mud brick tends to not be such a great building material is when you want to put a roof on something. You want to put a roof on something, and the first rain is going to put too much weight, and the mud brick is going to collapse under its own weight. So you need wood to go inside the mud. You need to have this sort of support, this wooden frame, in order to build any kind of sturdy ceiling or elevated floor. So that's something that does not grow very well in Mesopotamia. We have these reed swamps, and they can take these reeds and they can make these sort of arched roofs like we saw in Atrahasis. But they can't make a flat ceiling that you'd be able to walk on top of without wood. And there's no wood that's large enough and strong enough anywhere near any of these cities in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. So in the older sources, and it's ambiguous in the Old Babylonian version, but in the earlier versions that go back before the Old Babylonian versions, they're described as going up into the Zagros Mountains. And as you see on the map here, the Zagros Mountains are to the northeast. And that's quite a trip. You've got to go up the Tigris River a bit and then up into these mountains. And that's where most of Mesopotamia went during these early stage of civilization, up to the time period around 2000 BC. But because there was such a huge population all going to the same area to cut down the trees and bring them back, that completely deforested the area. So after a while, they had to give up on the Zagros Mountains, and they had to go all the way to Lebanon. And you see how far that is to the northwest. They had to go up the Euphrates River. And keep in mind, all of this area is the Arabian Desert. They can't just go straight across this. They have to go up, follow the Fertile Crescent, which is crescent shape, which, we've got Egypt over here, we've got Israel here. This area here has enough sort of balance between arable land and water and that sort of thing that it's manageable. So Enkidu and Gilgamesh have to go up the Euphrates River in the standard Babylonian version to go to Lebanon. And in these mountains here, there are cedar trees, and that's why even the modern nation of Lebanon has the cedar tree on its flag. So this is some of the finest timber for building, but notice how far the trek is. So we've got a bit of an ideology of where this source for timber came from. So if you're here in Uruk and you need to get timber, you need to go where the timber is. But notice in those two different narratives, the location of Humbaba changes to fit wherever they're going at that time to get the trees they need for resources. In the early accounts, Humbaba's over here, this is where they're going for trees, and later accounts he's over here, this is where they're going for trees. Now, who is Humbaba? Now, clearly this is the archetypal monster. If you got heroes, they need monsters to fight in our typical story, and this is the script we're most familiar with. Larger-than-life heroes need larger-than-life monsters to bring larger-than-life conflict and win the fame or whatever it is they're seeking. And Humbaba fits this nicely as it's described in the standard Babylonian versions and more fragmentarily in the Old Babylonian versions. But I asked you to go yet another step in analyzing this this part of the narrative, and that is I asked you to read about a newly discovered tablet that covers this element, this fight between the duo of Enkidu and Gilgamesh and the monster Humbaba. And because this fight between these, the world's greatest heroes and the world's biggest monster fit that archetype, fit that script, this story is represented around a wide geographic area. The image on the left, the carving on the left, comes from the area of modern-day Syria, and it was a Hittite version of that middle version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and depicts this monster being bound by these two heroes. Elsewhere, there's the lots of different depictions on cylinder seals from all over Mesopotamia, but it's widely represented, and there's also a lot of these Humbaba masks. It's not actually a mask, but it's like a depiction of Humbaba's head, which is imagined as having these intestinal, disgusting features on the outside of it. And there's several different variations on this theme. But it makes a good story if you like the hero stories. It's this sort of comic book, superhero or two superheroes versus this super monster villain in the version that you read. And that's the way it was interpreted for the last century of people studying Gilgamesh and studying in particular this episode. But just a few years ago, we had a translation of a tablet that had been sort of took a while to catch up with the rest of this narrative, and that actually fills in some of the gaps that we didn't even expect were there. The kinds of things that we did not expect. The kind of new tablet that Stephanie Dolly mentioned that doesn't actually fill in a gap we expected. It actually opens up a bunch of new questions. And that is the tablet I asked you to read, the translation and a description of the discovery of this tablet. So in this new, the article you read about the fragment and the translation of the fragment itself, we get something that clearly fits directly into the Tablet 5 because it has a catch line. It has some of the same words from lines of the Standard Babylonian version that we've had for a few years, but then what follows after that is not the kind of thing we may have expected, especially if we're thinking of Humbaba as this just pure evil monster who's evil for the sake of being evil. Instead, we get indications that he's this sort of lord of of animals, very similar to Enkidu, a protector of animals. He's been placed there by Enlil to guard the cedar forest, not just the resources of the cedar trees, but also this whole kingdom, this natural world that's there. And there are descriptions of monkeys and birds and all of this in the words of the translators, Al Rawi and George. They say, quote, "There's this abundance of exotic, costly materials in fabulous lands," which is a common literary motif. Perhaps more surprising is the revelation that the cedar forest was, in Babylonian literary imagination, a dense jungle inhabited by exotic and noisy fauna, in lines 17 through 26. Chatter of monkeys, chorus of cicada, and squawking of many kinds of birds formed a symphony or cacophony of that daily entertained the forest guardian, Humbaba. The passage gives a context for the simile "like musicians" that occurs in very broken context in the Hittite version of Gilgamesh and Enkidu's arrival at the cedar forest. Humbaba's jungle orchestra evokes those images found in the ancient Near Eastern art of animals playing musical instruments. Humbaba emerges not as a barbarian ogre, but as a foreign ruler entertained with music at the court in the manner of a Babylonian king, but the music of a more exotic kind played by a band of equally exotic musicians, end quote. And they go on to point out that these lines 61 through 72, even though they're broken, seem to indicate that Enkidu has been here before. Just as Enkidu was a sort of protector of animals from hunters, so too it appears that Humbaba was, and it seems that they have a sort of past history. And so the translators, Al Rawi and George, say, quote, "Another passage, 61 through 72, though consisting only of half lines, seems to confirm the point already known from another manuscript, that Enkidu had spent time with Humbaba in his youth. Humbaba, having become aware of the presence of intruders in his domain, appears to guess that it must be Enkidu returned home. Perhaps he might even be excited by the thought of a coming reunion. If it is right to read these fragmentary lines a tender reference to earlier life together, then Humbaba's subsequent betrayal by Enkidu, who has brought with him a hostile alien, the King Gilgamesh, becomes even more poignant, end quote. So what happens, this character, this monster in a fragmentary version, we might interpret this as this, clearly this fight with this monster, tends to be basically just a battle over resources. Humbaba wants to protect the cedar forest. Gilgamesh wants to take the cedar, and Enkidu has to choose sides, and now he's made friends with Gilgamesh, so he's actually helping his new friend against his old friend. This is one interpretation. Now again, even with this new fragment, we still have broken pieces, so it's hard to tell. But there's at least two different potential ways to read, two different scripts we can impose on this same text, the same narrative as it is. And then there's this moment of regret when they look around and see what they've done. So we have this huge, horrendous fight between the two heroes and Humbaba, this very destructive fight. We have threats on both sides. Humbaba is still, telling them he's going to, bite their throats like a lion. He's going to, tear them apart. But he's at the same time sort of threatening them to stay away, but also, pleading with them to stay away. And it's clear that Enkidu is kind of egging on Gilgamesh, even as Gilgamesh is kind of afraid to go in for the kill. Enkidu realizes that he's locked in. He can't undo this. The best thing they can do is just to go ahead and finish off Humbaba. And then afterwards, there's this regret. He says, my friend, we have reduced the forest to a wasteland. How shall we answer Enlil in Nippur? Because Enlil, the god, had a temple in Nippur. In your might, slew the guardian. What was this wrath of yours that you went trampling the forest? So they have to sort of reconcile themselves with what they've just done. They have these new resources, and the way Enkidu seems to need to atone for what he's done is to build a gate in honor of Enlil, and he's going to use these timbers that they float down the river. He's going to use that to, as the support for a mud brick gate that will be, the sort of sacrifice or this offering that will commemorate Enlil. Hopefully now that Enlil's appointed guardian, Humbaba, has been killed, this is one way to appease them. But as we're going to see, there are going to be a lot of consequences of this, both in the action itself, killing Humbaba, but also in the sort of place this takes Enkidu and Gilgamesh, the place it takes their egos. So now that you've come this far, this is by far the most actual redaction you'll have to do in your own head and sort of put together yourself. Your next assignment is to continue on with tablets 6 through 12 in the standard Babylonian version. So you don't have to flip back and forth, and you don't have any other, once you've read the Al-Rawi and George translation of the new tablet 5 fragment, as well as the Old Babylonian version, standard Babylonian version, up to tablet 5. Now from tablet 6 to 12, you don't have to flip back and forth. But you're going to find that there are some things that still don't quite make sense. Everything after this comes from the standard Babylonian version, and yet if you take some of the principles that we've applied or that we've found from reading what we knew to be redactions, and you look at what you read in the rest of the Epic of Gilgamesh, you're going to see there are still some cracks, there's still some seams, there's still some indications that this is not one coherent narrative. This is itself the product of redaction. But I'll leave that to you to figure out, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.